In news from the continent, Nigeria's President Bola Tinubu has offered a wage increase for low-income workers ahead of a major labour strike. Tinubu says the increase will ease the burden brought by the scrapping of a petrol subsidy. In May this year, the president removed a decades-old subsidy and ended foreign exchange restrictions, which sent the cost of living through the roof. Yesterday, in a national broadcast marking 63 years of independence, Tinubu defended the reforms, saying they will put the economy on a path to recovery. Well, joining us now is Head of Pan-African Thought Conversation at the University of Johannesburg, Dr. Adeoye Akinola. Dr. Akinola, appreciate your time. Now, how do you perceive the recent economic reforms and policy changes in Nigeria, particularly the removal of the fuel subsidies and liberalization of the currency?
Thank you, and I'm happy to be on your program today. Maybe let me first say this. I don't see the removal of subsidy as a reform. For me, I see it more as a declaration from a president that just wants to be seen as doing something. Because if you want to reform, there are many steps that you will take before you announce the decision of the government on a particular sector or particular issue that you are dealing with. That did not happen. And one thing that we should also know, of course, I know there are corruptions in the subsidy scheme, and I also know that consecutive Nigerian governments have failed to actually combat corruption. So it seems as if the only possible reaction from a serious government may be to remove the fuel subsidy. But my concern in this case is because that the current president did not do due diligence. No expansive consultation before he announced the removal of the subsidy. And with the removal of the subsidy, what we have seen was that particularly in July, the price of petroleum resources hit almost $1 in Nigeria. That's about 617 naira. And that was the highest in the history of Nigeria. You must also remember that Nigeria is an oil-producing country who relies on almost 90% of its foreign exchange earnings from crude oil. And half of its budget is actually being funded by crude oil resources. So Nigeria is not just a country that relies on international market for its oil product, but Nigeria also exports oil resources, and they also make so much money when the prices in the international market is exceedingly high. So Nigerians will tell you this is not a reform. This is just coming from an hostile government.
Well, we must talk about the National Labour Congress and the Trade Union Congress, because they've called for a national strike in Nigeria due to rising costs and obviously the government's response. Now, what role do you see labour unions playing in shaping economic policies? I mean, are they able to put sufficient pressure on the Nigerian government to address the issues?
Absolutely. If one is conversant with the history of Nigeria, particularly the influence of the trade labor unions on governance issues, they have been very effective. We remember 2012 when similar case evolved in Nigeria, and the labor union had to shut down Nigerian governance for more than 4 days. And so they have that capacity if they can mobilize their members. And in this case, two biggest trade union in Nigeria have actually come together. That's the Nigerian Labour Congress and the TUC, Trade Union Congress. They have come together to try to mobilize their constituency towards embarking on the strike tomorrow. Not only the two organizations, the Nigerian Union of Petroleum and Natural Gas Workers, we call them NUPEG in Nigeria, has also directed its own members to also comply with the strike action of the two major trade unions in Nigeria. So if these three organizations are committed to actually putting pressures on the Nigerian government from reversing its decisions on subsidy removal, I don't see how the Tinubu administration can actually continue to insist on subsidy removal. We also understand that meetings were held from Friday, but the labor union did not turn up on Friday, but they attended a meeting with government yesterday yesterday, and they still insisted on some of the propositions they have put on the table, particularly the increase in the salaries of Nigerian workers. But they actually demanded for 200% increase, while government has actually not accepted to their demand. So the meeting will continue today between the government and the labor union representatives.
Well, you speak about President Tinubu's response, and that's around announcing measures like a temporary minimum wage hike, a cheap gas-powered public transport and social security cash transfers. How effective do you think these measures will be in mitigating the economic challenges faced by Nigerians?
Exceedingly ineffective. I don't see how salary increase, no matter the percentage, can ease the economic hostility in the country. We also have to know that not all Nigerians are salary earners. So even if you increase the salary of workers, in most sections of the Nigerian population will be cut off because they are not salary earners. I also know when you talk about the buses, we have seen this over the years. In 2012, when similar case happened between Nigerians against the government that tried to increase the price of crude, the Nigerian government promised to create an institution called SureP. SureP was to develop Nigeria to respond to the fuel increment in fuel crisis and begin to alleviate the hardship on Nigeria, but that did not happen. So Nigerians do not even trust the government. The question is, how many buses will you provide for a population of more than 200 million people? Where would the buses be? And how do you want to also ensure the sustainability of those transportation systems? Nigerians know that the government will make promises and they will renege on these promises. So what can actually save Nigeria from this position they have put themselves into is actually policy response, not just increments in salaries.
Well, I've got 2 minutes, Dr. Akinola. Let's talk about some of that response as far as policy is concerned. Now, in your mind, what does the Nigerian government need to do? What does that policy look like for you?
Thank you so much. They first need to actually convey a community meeting, or maybe you can call it town hall meeting, where all the stakeholders will come together and see the facts on the table. Then they can begin to engage, and even the labor union, it's not as if they are just exceedingly stubborn. When they see facts, then they can rub minds together and actually plan towards implementing an effective policies. There are many sectors of the Nigerians that have been ignored, neglected for the past decades. Agricultural sector have been neglected. The mining sector invariably have been neglected. And those are the sectors that the Nigerian government can put life into as against this over-reliance of crude oil. So the Nigerian government should consult. And after that, then they can begin to implement policies that will actually better the lives of Nigerians.
Now, when we take a look at the challenges that Nigeria is having, it is viewed as the largest economy on the continent, it's an economic powerhouse. What are the implications on neighboring economies or neighboring countries and the African continent at large?
Thank you so much. And when we look at the neighboring country, this is not even the time for Nigeria to be in crisis and undergo a political instability, because we know neighboring countries, many of them have been overtaken by the militaries. Of course, we see Nigerian institutions as relatively strong, and it might be difficult for military government to succeed now. But even in terms of economy, many of those regional countries actually depends on Nigeria. The strength of Nigeria economy will have impact in countries like Niger, in countries like Togo, in countries like Cote d'Ivoire, because of the interconnectedness of people, not just the trade, but people are actually interconnected. And many of these countries have many of their populations in Nigeria because of the economic prospects in Nigeria. But as Nigeria is experiencing this declining in their economic fortunes, it doesn't portend good for the West African region.
Dr. Akinola, appreciate your time. Dr. Adeoye Akinola is the head of Pan-African Thought Conversation at the University of Johannesburg.